Hello and welcome in. This is Felix Reyes here with Football Conversations. Joining me today is Mike Golic Jr., college football analyst for TNT Sports and co-host of the Echoes podcast. Before we get into it, Mike and I go back a bit. I used to produce for him at ESPN Radio for the Notre Dame pregame shows. So it's great to reconnect here. Really appreciate you joining.
No, appreciate you having me. And you're right. It's crazy to think how far back it goes now, and always fun to get to link back up for stuff like this, especially ahead of something like the NFL draft, which is such a fun time of year for so many of us.
Oh, for sure. Hey, so since Notre Dame has a few really interesting prospects in this class, I figure that might be a good place to start. That backfield with Jeremiyah Love and Jadarian Price gave defenses very different problems. When you watch them, what separates their games, and how do you see each projecting at the next level?
Yeah, I mean, you start with Jeremiah, who is, we overuse generational a lot when it comes to the way that we describe prospects coming out, but he really seems to be in that tax bracket of player with how he's viewed both in league circles, what he did and accomplished at Notre Dame. For my money, I think you could argue the best Notre Dame running back in the school's history, which includes some greats, and certainly in the modern era. They just haven't had a player with this talent level. I think this thing that stands out with Jeremiah is he fits so perfectly into the modern mold of what high-end NFL backs have to be, which is they have to be options for you on your offense. They have to have the ability to get the tough yards in the middle that Jeremiah can, be a home run threat for you, which he showed both on tape and at the combine he's capable of. But then you've got to have that other phase of, all right, can you be not only a receiver out of the backfield, but someone we can split out who's got the route tree available to them? And he put more of that on tape this year. But for my money, the biggest area that he separated this year was he improved so much in pass protection, both in his understanding of it, technically the way he approached it, just his overall demeanor. It was personal to him, and you could tell he brought that attitude to that part of his game. And so once he elevated that, there's nothing he can't do on the field for you. And so I think if you're an NFL team, it's why some have him as the best prospect, if not one of the top three in this draft, and he'll be a guy that's a surefire first rounder. And then, also comes in, him and Jadarian both have gotten the benefit of sharing a backfield where they don't come in. You think of Derrick Henry, who's defied the odds in so many ways years ago, with all of the reps that he had under his belt at Alabama. These guys have been in a timeshare their whole careers in a way that's going to help both of them at the next level. And they're so different. Jadarian as a runner is more of your true one-cut slasher, where when he puts his foot in the ground and makes a decision to either bounce to the perimeter or try and cut back against the grain, he can really find that next gear speed-wise. He's so smooth and decisive in that way. And, still in his own right, has that home run ability. You saw it as a special teamer, an All-American kick returner at Notre Dame, and a guy who had plenty of big plays and big moments in that regard, who also improved as a pass protector, who probably has underrated hands out of the backfield, but just in comparison to Jeremiah was always going to lose that one, in terms of how people thought about the two of them. And so at 99% of other schools, he'd have been your one feature back in the country and would have been one of the best in college football the way he still was. And so he's one where very different runner in the way I described, but still in a class where after these first two, there's a little bit more projecting you have to do, or the roles are a little bit more specific. Could be a fringe first rounder if people want that fifth year control, but if not, I think would be a great fit behind a team that maybe doesn't need you to come in and be Superman right away in the second round.
Yeah, I mean, and with that said, you just mentioned it, could be a fringe first rounder. Do you think there's a real chance that Love and Jadarian Price are the first two running backs off the board?
I think for me, there's no question they'll be the first two off the board. It really is just, because I think the one thing that's kind of gotten lost in the Jeremiah discussion, he's so great. Everyone loves him so much, and it's awesome. People say good things. But running back is still a position where even if you're great, you need the stuff around you. You need an offensive line. And so the conversation for Jeremiah is complicated in round one, where he's going to get picked, because a lot of those teams I don't think are in the place offensive line-wise to support him the way that you'd like to see. And so it's going to be a little more challenging. I think Ashton Jeanty is a great player. I think Jeremiah is a better prospect, but Ashton Jeanty was an incredible player, a Heisman Trophy candidate. And he went to a Las Vegas team that was broken up front, and it showed. They weren't able to put him in position to do the things that we've been used to seeing. Jeremiah is going to run into that. And, you get to some of the contract valuation stuff, the savings in the first round on more premium positions that people usually take in those spots. And I think that's only amplified towards the end with Jadarian. So it's really going to be, what do you think as an organization is the opportunity cost of being a team that has a need at that spot that misses out? And now all of a sudden, as you look further in the draft, you feel like that talent gap jumps up. So it feels more and more like the conversation has been like high second round for him, but I still think he's the second back off the board.
Yeah, that honestly would be pretty cool to see both guys, especially the two that share the backfield at Notre Dame. Touching on Notre Dame for a second, I have to talk about Malachi Fields, who I felt was getting a ton of love during the Senior Bowl because of the size, the physicality, and how he competed all week. Do you think that week he confirmed he's like a real boundary receiver prospect, or is there a gap between intriguing traits and a guy teams truly trust at the next level?
I think he can be successful at the next level. Like, I always think the tape trumps everything. And we know the 40 time wasn't necessarily his friend at the combine. And I don't believe ran at Notre Dame's pro day after that. But we always knew that. You turn on the tape of Malachi and you never saw a burner. You saw a guy who, like other big bodied receivers we'd seen in the past, the way he's going to create separation is vertically. He's going to be able to go up and get it. He's got great hands. He can contest the catch in traffic. And you look at his production from Virginia across to Notre Dame, where he mastered those obvious situations, and then to pair it with Senior Bowl production. I think that hype is real. I do think it's also difficult at the NFL where, hey, if you've really got to rely on that because speed separation is not going to be your thing, then it can create some challenges. I've seen him for a lot of people. I was reading The Beast by Dane Brugler yesterday. I think he's got him around wide receiver 9 or 10, something in that range. And that probably feels about right. But he is both a set of gifts, production, and character. Like, the right kind of guy is going to come in and be a positive force inside your building, is going to understand the work that comes with that opportunity, that I'd be betting to bet on him becoming a successful guy at the next level in that spot.
Well, this year's class, right? Many are saying the depth in this class is really big, but very different from that 2024 class where we had Malik Neighbors up top, Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison Jr. This class has Carnell Tate at the top, right? Many believe that he might be the top pick. You have the consensus top three, I guess, are Carnell Tate, Jordan Tyson, and Lemon, right? Carnell Tate is an interesting guy for me, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it because a lot of people, and I say a lot of people because when you see online and Twitter and all those, people talk about how he's more of a wide receiver 2 prospect. And some of that probably comes with playing alongside a guy like Jeremiah Smith, who we're going to hear a lot about next season. I'm interested to hear from you when you evaluate Tate. Do you see those traits? Do you think it can allow him to develop into that true wide receiver 1 at the next level? What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, no, I do. Like, I have a general rule of thumb with Ohio State wide receivers where it's draft them high and prosper until further notice. Now, changes in the coaching staff there with Brian Hartline finally leaving the nest. Maybe you could change that in years to come. But the talent pipeline, the way that those guys are coached in that position, it's blue chip stock I always feel comfortable buying. Like, every Ohio State guy is usually playing opposite another future Sunday guy who's probably an all-pro or a Pro Bowler at worst. And so I don't get caught up in that stuff. A big guy can separate at the high end, can, take the top off of defense in certain instances, strong hands at the point of attack. Like, there's a lot of stuff to like. In this class, it's interesting, like, the conversation to me, because Mekhi Lemon, more of that slot role, is sort of a different conversation than, for me, Carnell Tate and Jordan Tyson, who, if Jordan Tyson hadn't finished the last 2 seasons on the shelf out of Arizona State, he'd be my wide receiver 1, hands down. I am so enamored with that guy. He's so dynamic. He can go up and get it. He's physical. He gets off, press really well at the line, good feet. Like, he's everything you want. He's a really complete player. It's just the injury concerns for some people are going to be there. And so, with that on the table, I do think Carnell Tate, being as physically gifted as he is to go along with all that stuff, is a guy that can absolutely be a wide receiver 1 for you at the next level.
I like that you mentioned Tyson specifically, because I do agree with you. I think if it weren't for his durability issues, we would have him possibly at the very top of the draft. May even put him in the top 5, just given the way this draft kind of is shaping out so far. Do you think there's a clear top tier at the receiver position right now? Are you a Lemon fan, or is there another wide receiver currently not getting enough attention right now that should be in that discussion?
No, I definitely think that's kind of been the upper crust in this group. Like, again, when I talk about Lemon and him being in a little bit of a different category because of the slot, that's just, the way that position can impact things is a little bit different. But he's still an incredible player, another guy who can stretch the field really well. It does a really good job of getting open in the short area. I mean, you go back and, we mentioned some of the Notre Dame guys. Like, I've told people, anyone who listen, Leonard Moore will be your number 1 cornerback in the 2027 NFL draft. And watching that good on good of him and Mekhi Lemon, where he moved down into the slot to go up against Mekhi, there were reps where, hey, listen, Leonard Moore did a great job locking him down, which I think was true for most of the day. But there were still spots where Mekhi Lemon was able to get off that press, make things happen, and stress them, and just didn't get the ball right away in those areas. And so I still do think he deserves to be talked about in that tax bracket. But you look at some of the other guys that are angling around, I think right in that same range, like Casey Concepcion. I know, my friend Mina Kimes over at ESPN, big fan of his coming out of Texas A&M. Omar Cooper Jr., who had a sensational season for the national championship Hoosiers. Denzel Boston, really interesting, bigger body guy. And so I still think there's that top group of 3, but this is one of the positions you mentioned along with edge that comes with a ton of depth. And so you start to get out of that group and you still feel like you're going to be finding productive players for a while at wide receiver.
Yeah, definitely a good year if you are looking for a wide receiver to add on to that. Looking at the quarterback position, had to bring this up to you. It's an interesting conversation for sure, because it seemed like prior to the season started, we kind of had an idea, and mainly off season starting, right? We pretty much had an idea. It's Fernando Mendoza at top, but lately we've been hearing the conversation along with Ty Simpson. Do you see that as a real QB1 debate right now, or is there still some separation between the two?
No, I think QB1's pretty sewn up. Like, I understand the concerns with, Mendoza, shotgun-based, RPO-based offense, a team that had other things for him to rely on. Like, I've heard the J.J. McCarthy stuff about having such a complete defense and run game and all these things versus Ty Simpson, who operated an offense that had some more NFL stuff to it, operated an offense where there was not really a threat of run for the majority of the year. It was him going and dropping back. And then we know the injuries that were a part of the end of the season that affected the way he threw, all the stuff that we've heard since then. But I still think Mendoza, like, the physicality is part of it. The fact that Ty Simpson was hurt this year, the fact that Garrett Nussmeier, similar size profile in the same boat, like, Fernando Mendoza is the prototype. He's a 6'5", 235-pound quarterback who we saw get his ass kicked and get hit a little too much during the playoff run in some of those end games. Be able to take it and get back up, because that's why you buy that kind of build. That's why we've always prioritized that at that spot, because especially going into a bad team early on, there's probably going to be some of that pressure. But you combine that with his football acumen overall, what we've seen about his football intelligence, I think that's a guy that's going to have the aptitude to do the different things at the next level that's required in this position, to go along with an arm that's not like elite. It's not like he's going out here with one of these Elway cannons, but it's strong enough to get the ball to places that he needs to go, heady enough to, listen, in an RPO world where you're making post-snap decisions based off movement of a player or two, some of which maybe go into pre-snap decisions as well. I think is a guy that I would trust to do all that, combined with production across multiple years. The 15 starts for Ty Simpson looms large. There's too much historical precedence with that to think that, maybe he's the guy to overcome it, but we've been shown time and time again, it's a difficult bet. Now, this isn't Trey Lance, Anthony Richardson, where, you were betting on the physical upside of that either. At least those guys had elite physical tools to sell you. Ty doesn't really have that. And so the math problem becomes a little bit more difficult. And I think this winds up being a lot more like the draft class with, where we tried to talk ourselves into Malik Willis as a first rounder, and the NFL felt very differently. Will Levis's senior year, where every one of us was convinced he was a first rounder, and the NFL felt differently. And I think this is one where maybe draft talk just needs something to talk about so badly this cycle that we're all going to convince ourselves of something that I think maybe the league will exercise some rare patience on at quarterback. And he'll be more of a second round guy where I think he has a good opportunity in the right situation to be successful without the stress of having to come in and be the savior the way you need to be when you're a top pick.
Yeah, and you talk about situation, right? What better place for Fernando Mendoza, who we're expecting to go #1 overall? It almost seems like one of the biggest locks in all draft seasons that we've seen in previous years. I've been a fan. I'm a big nerd when it comes to the NFL draft, right? I've been watching it for like the last 20 years. And just to see this year, it just feels like, yeah, there's no question. It's Fernando Mendoza at 1. But with that said, with the Raiders, right? And you see kind of what they did over the offseason, Tyler Linderbaum, Clint Kubiak, and just kind of adding more and more pieces to that puzzle. Find it very interesting. I'm curious your perspective on this. Do you think they're going to start do you think we're going to start seeing more teams let rookies sit again? The Raiders bringing in Kirk Cousins feels like a pretty good example of that, especially if they draft Mendoza, who we're expecting to go there, right? And let the veterans start early. Is this actually the better path for some of these guys moving forward?
I always think that's a case by case basis. Some guys are just going to be ready for that stuff. Like every once in a while, you'll get a guy who is going to come out and do it. But I think creating a situation where no matter how it works out, right? If Fernando Mendoza were to come out right now, the Kirk Cousins deal got reported as one thing. It's a 1-year deal that's, properly compensated up front for the most part and continues Kirk Cousins' long history of cashing into the bank. But it creates an opportunity where no matter how it goes, if Fernando Mendoza comes out and, man, just looks ready, like you want to get him out there and get the reps because he goes through your offseason program, goes through training camp, and he just looks like someone who's ready for the moment. Well, then you've got a backup in Kirk Cousins with a ton of high-end experience who can be a sounding board for your young quarterback. And, man, if you need to sit him down at some point so he can catch his breath, not going to cause a bunch of controversy because we kind of know what Kirk Cousins is at this point. And if he's not ready, then you've got a guy in Kirk Cousins that is still all of those things and now further removed from the injury on his way into Atlanta that could make him someone that's a bit more of a viable option that would certainly pair well with what we know Clint Kubiak does on offense. And then you combine that with, like you said, going and getting the best center on the market and paying a premium price to set that foundation. Clint Kubiak, who we've seen now the last 2 stops really at the helm of the Saints offense and then the Seahawks for the title this year, is an offense that's very quarterback friendly, that mixes in all of the motion, the things in the run game that can help be your friend of the quarterback. And they're right now doing things offensively to create an environment that goes along with Brock Bowers having arguably the best pass catching weapon at tight end in the NFL now, considering that guys like Kittle and Kelsey are getting up there in years. And you can look and see what the plan is there. And I think that's the best compliment you can give the Raiders at this point is it does feel like, all right, we've got an idea of how we want to build this the right way to try and give our young guy the best chance possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on offensive line. That's something you're obviously very familiar with and can't do this without asking you a little bit about that. I definitely wanted to spend some time talking about the offensive line with you because it feels like it doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but it impacts everything an offense does. My first guy I want to talk about is Spencer Fano, who is an interesting because how well he moves, but how much does athleticism help tackles become more of that, or how much does athleticism help tackles overcome measurement concerns?
Yeah, it's funny, like this year having this conversation both about Spencer at tackle, but also on the other side about like Ruben Bain at edge, I think is a good way to sort of siphon this down to what it's really about, which is arm length is certainly something that matters to an extent. Like it's a tool in your tool belt. If you're an edge defender, it can help you get that extra bit of separation. And I always thought about it, if you're an offensive lineman, it's like a get out of jail free card. If you get into a bad situation, arm length can help bail you out and give you that extra half second it takes to keep your quarterback clean at that level. But it's also not a total necessity if your game's not built on that. And if you are a guy who's athletic enough, we did this conversation last year with Will Campbell coming out of LSU where, hey, if you've got good enough feet and athleticism to keep yourself in between defenders, to have that be the thing that gets you out of trouble, that keeps you in front of a guy. So if the arm length becomes an issue, you can reset, redo your foundation and overcome that. Then it's not as big of a concern to me. And so the thing with this year's tackle class is it's a weird group where it's different flavors of ice cream. It's guys that people are talking about maybe they could kick inside to certain spots. Fano's gotten some of that too. But, none of them, I think, stand out as like, oh, there's an OT1 with a bullet. I like Spencer because especially when you go back and look at the 2024 tape where their offense was a lot more under center, 2 tight end, put you in 3-point stances and go maul people. He's got that. He's technically sound. He does move incredibly well. We saw that reflected in the combine performances there. So I think he's got what it takes to overcome that. I also think public sentiment wise, we're coming off of a bad last month of the season for Will Campbell, where we just conveniently ignored that he was coming off a knee injury. The push looked different. They took away that tool that helped him overcome the arm length at the time of year when the Patriots were most watched and talked about. So everyone, I think, is going to over-index on arm length in these conversations, ignoring the fact that the tape shows a guy that competed at a high level even with that and was successful.
I have another one, Max E. Honichor. I'm over here making sure I'm saying that correctly. The kid from ASU. There's a lot of talk about him. I feel like he's been kind of rising up boards. I know Dane Brugler talks a lot about him on The Beast as well. I'm curious because his athletic profile is so rare, but for a player who didn't even start football until 2021, how do you figure out when upside is worth betting on versus when rawness is still too big of a risk to take?
Yeah, he is. I just did with Dominique Foxworth on his podcast. We did the My Guys, and Max was one of mine. Like I got to call Big 12 games for TNT, like you mentioned, in the broadcast booth this year. And we had ASU 3 times, and the more and more you watched him, he's the ultimate basketball on grass player, which, that was where his background was. You mentioned the late start to football. But you go and turn on games like the Texas Tech game where you're going up against David Bailey and Romello Height, these 2 great edge rushers. And he's going toe-to-toe for them in the foot speed department, which was rare for anyone across this season. And it's hard not to get enamored with that. The line for me is always, do you have the offensive line coach for that? Because more often than not now, you don't have the time. Like you go all the way back, 2011 was when the NFL collective bargaining agreement changed. And the players wanted to take hits off their body. And so the offseason program got shorter, training camp got shorter. There were more rules on time on field. And that affects offensive line the most because it's the most learned position on the field. It's unnatural, the things that you're asked to do. And so it requires repetition over and over again to sharpen that. And so if you don't have that, you got to have the coach. Like he was one I remember seeing mocked early to Philadelphia. And if this was still Jeff Stoutland's Philadelphia Eagles, that's one of those where we'd all be shaking our fists on draft day going, how did we let Howie in Philadelphia get away from this again? Because he's the perfect Stoutland profile player. And so you've got to have a real honest conversation with yourself as an organization. For him, Monroe Freeling out of Georgia is similar, where his rise kind of reminds me of Penei Sewell. You watched him get better every week that he played. And he's so gifted and he fits that true NFL left tackle mode where he's big, strong, and long. And you say, do we have the kind of person that can go and coach him up at the level you're going to need to, is I think the discussion that each team has to have with itself.
No, I love that you mentioned that, especially with offensive line coach. I'm a Bears fan, so Dan Rochar I know he's talked about that recently in Teron Armstead's podcast. He was mentioning how there is he's got all these tackles in the room, but none are anywhere near the level of a Darnell Wright, who happens to play right tackle. So he still doesn't feel like that left tackle is still in the room. But I mean, I might as well just ask you that question. As a Bears fan, I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't ask you about pick number 25. I know a lot of people are mentioning defense, and I think defense is obviously very, very important. But I'm very intrigued, especially after listening to that clip in that podcast. It doesn't seem like he feels like that player is in that room. How do you feel about them going after an offensive lineman at pick number 25? Do you think that there's possibly that guy, maybe a Monroe Freeling? I know we're hearing he could go up as high as 6, low in the 20s. We got Caden Proctor. We have Max. There's a few guys there. I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think Monroe's going to be available at that point. He's a guy that really seems to, especially after the combine, be skyrocketing in terms of how he's talked around teams. But I don't think you can go wrong in adding to offensive line. Credit to Chicago for staying ahead of things. You got the surprise retirement from Drew Dahlman, so you immediately go and get Garrett Bradbury, who isn't a one-to-one replacement, but's a good player that fits what you do, a veteran guy that's going to help in that spot. And so, for Caleb, we saw what a benefit it was to have the kind of protection he did, to have the run game to lean on, and to have that line secured. And so if you feel like you've got your guy of the future, you've, like you said, got a coach in Rochar that I think is capable, but also like to be doing this, in that offensive line room that's got so many good veterans to soak up knowledge and learn from is another one of those things. We talked about how important coaching is before, but also to then have veterans in your room that are going to be able to groom you the right way. And I certainly think Chicago would have that. So like you said, defense is probably where you need to err, considering the turnover regression is going to hit really hard after last year. You already had some losses in the secondary, but between that or maybe another weapon, since you obviously let DJ Moore go and got him to Buffalo this offseason, you feel good about the guys in that room. But I would say defense is probably going to be it there. But if one of these offensive tackles that we've talked about happens to fall to this point and the value starts to make sense for you, I don't think you can ever go wrong drafting offensive linemen. It's boring and maybe not as sexy to some fans and other people, but it's the kind of stuff that builds the foundation of championship teams.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel, and I kept telling people too, I mean, obviously defense is a big part of it, but I'm a big BPA guy. We saw it last year with Luther Burden. Yeah. Not many expected him to be there, but I do feel that at number 25, if they were to go offensive lineman, it feels like it's a bit of a stamp of approval from Dan Rochar, given the players that might be on the board. On that storyline that, caught my attention this offseason was the Lions, specifically having talked about potentially moving Penei Sewell from right tackle to left tackle. So for people who assume that's an easy switch, how significant is that transition even for an elite player? What changes the most when flipping sides?
Yeah, I mean, just everything. Like, I forget if it was Joe Thomas or someone else who basically said it's like going to wipe your butt with a different hand. Like, it's, yes, think about anything you've got to do, and you're doing that without the threat of violence on the other side, where especially once you get a lot of reps, early, when I got to college, the first 3.5 years of my Notre Dame career, I was a swing guy back up on the inside trying to see the field wherever. So you practice at all these different positions, you get reps there. Once you're a starter and a high-end guy like Penei is, your life is built in one direction. You see not only the plays, the way the offense is installed, your responsibility, but just biomechanically, where am I putting my weight before each snap to accomplish my goal on that? How do I want to do that? And you've made so much of that second nature that allows you to think about some of the more high-level stuff. How am I communicating with the guy next to me? How am I mixing up sets against high-end pass rushers to keep them off balance? And so kind of like when a center starts screwing up their snap and has to think about that again, now when you're switching sides, the things you work so hard to make second nature become first nature again. And so all those higher order priorities kind of have to go by the wayside while you learn that early on. It's such a case-by-case thing because it is a hard switch to make. But Penei is like a 1% athlete at that position. And he's a guy that, kind of like Tristan Wirfs is the other one who did this recently and with incredible success, who is also a 1% athlete, one of the best players in the league. But with those guys and how gifted they are athletically, like John Calipari, I think always talked about physical genius as this thing that he relished in his guys, like spatial awareness, the ability to do all that. These guys are physical geniuses in addition to gifted football players who no doubt from the neck up are great too. And so I'd be a lot more confident in betting on a guy like him to do it than I would the vast majority of people that play that position, just because he is so good at everything. And again, you go back to Penei's time in college, every week you watched him get better. Every week you watched him clearly absorb coaching and do all these different things. And so I'm going to trust a guy with that proven aptitude and skill set to be able to make that transition that happens. And the coaching there as well. That's another place where they've got a great offensive line room there. And a group that I would definitely trust to help him make that.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, NFL, real quick, big important question for you. As we look ahead into the season, what storyline do you think will define the NFL by the time we get to November?
By the time we get to November, I would probably say whatever happens with Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens this year. Like you can already kind of see the steam building on a lot of the talk shows about this being a prove-it time for Lamar Jackson, who's been unequivocally one of the best quarterbacks. When you talk about the 4 to 5 world beaters that we have in the league at that position at any given time, he is a consensus one of those names, a 2-time MVP. But the postseason success in the high ends eluded him. And now, you're having the change with Todd Monken leaving and going to Cleveland. Jesse Minter comes over to try and reassert that defensive identity. And for Lamar Jackson and offense, this is a group where you lost your backup tight end and a guy who had been an important pass catcher in Isaiah Likely, who goes over with Harbaugh. You lost your center and Tyler Linderbaum on an offensive line that the guard spots was a little shaky last year and are still, I think, looking for that true wide receiver run. Zay Flowers is a great player, but kind of like we talked about with Mekhi Lemon, not traditionally what you think of as a field-changing, defense-altering number one wide receiver on the outside, even if I think at times he can mimic that in his role and does a really good job. And so you've got questions that need to be answered by, if Lamar Jackson's healthy, him being great enough to help overcome all that stuff. And I'm hoping between now, the draft, and the rest of the offseason, they supplement in some of those areas. They feel like he's in a good space. But I think knowing what Baltimore had as the expectations that weren't realized last year, and now that John Harbaugh has been the piece to go from that organization based off all that, it puts a lot of pressure on them in an AFC picture that has a lot of great quarterbacks and a lot of teams that are going to make this season interesting. And I think they'll go a long way in defining, successful or not, what the AFC playoff picture looks for on the high end.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think, excuse me. I think that one of the big things about them as well, free agency in the NFL isn't the same as the NBA, where you feel like there's big splash. But in the last couple of years, we've been seeing that a little bit more. And I feel with Baltimore, when we hear Baltimore, we think about the Max Crosby situation and then the Trey Hendrickson thing that happens the next day. But one of the things that I feel that was very underlooked with that team specifically was the coaching staff they brought in. And I've heard you too on podcasts before talk about Dwayne Ledford. I believe that's how you pronounce his name, right? From the Atlanta Falcons. Yep. And then we got the OC from the Chicago Bears, Gentry Minter as the head coach, and all the defensive guys that they were able to bring in. I believe they brought in, what's his name? Is it Zach Ward? Did they bring? Or Zach Ward with the Giants? I'm not too sure, but they Giants, brought in they did bring in a lot of the guys. I think it was a guy from Miami, but they brought in a lot of familiar faces as well to help with the defense and now to add more to the offense. And I'm really, really intrigued and interested to see what they're going to do with that.
Yeah, and you're right. That's good context of the rest of that. I guess I buried the lead of the Max Crosby trade situation and everything that happened as a result of that. Going to put the bullseye on their back. But you're right. It is a staff that defensively should have them back very quickly to the kind of form that we saw a couple of years ago with Mike McDonald, that they tried to recreate in-house by keeping Zach Ward on, and now are bringing in Jesse Minter, who proven between Michigan and going to the Chargers, he can come in and quickly install and get that unit playing at a high level. It's just going to be offensively on the other side. Todd Monken was a huge part of the second boom of Lamar Jackson's career post Greg Moman, where they added the kind of pass concepts that we had all been begging for. So it is a very interesting team in a lot of ways. I still have a ton of confidence in Lamar Jackson. The evolution is going to be interesting because last year, even before the injuries were a part of it, his legs as a big functioning piece of that offense were something that was used less and less. Part of that's, I think, age and maybe, personal preferences. I don't know. Those aren't conversations I'm a part of, but how the offense continues to evolve with him at the helm is going to be fascinating, even with the defense on the other side being what it is.
Yeah. Do you feel that a team like the Rams, like the Los Angeles Rams, who right now seem to be the Super Bowl favorite for next season, they got a big pick in number 13. And with all the rumors we've been hearing over the offseason about possibly trading for a guy like A.J. Brown and just kind of getting into a lot of the rumor mills, they made a lot of big moves. They got McDuffie as well at the cornerback position. They've been making moves. Do you think Baltimore is the one that's going to challenge them the most this season?
I think the NFC West is still the division that's going to challenge each other the most this year. Seattle's got some, significant losses, both in terms of personnel, which happens when you win the Super Bowl, as well as, losing Clint Kubiak to a head coaching job. But I still think as long as Mike McDonald's there, that defense is going to be a war machine. They hit on some really good young picks. Nicky Nwari looks like their version of Kyle Hamilton, Byron Murphy in the interior. There's so much to like, combined with an offense that still employs what's now the highest paid wide receiver in league history in JSN to feel good about. And San Francisco did all that stuff last year, again, being one of the most injured teams in football. So if that team even has regression to something even approaching the mean in terms of that, then you've got a three-headed monster in that division that's going to be such a week in, week out challenge for those guys. But there's no question the Rams had a glaring weakness coming off the postseason and immediately went to inject some life into that. Puka Nacua now has some life off the field that he's got to get straightened out before, they'll certainly, continue to make him one of the highest paid guys in NFL history at a spot where on the field, production wise, he's earned that to go along with Devontae Adams and the rest of that room. So, I think what they do with that, what they do is going to be fascinating, but ultimately this is a team that right now, especially with Stafford playing the way he did last year, is going to be really well positioned. And I think right now is and should be the Super Bowl favorite.
Yeah. A lot of good storylines going into the NFL season. So should be exciting to watch. We also have the NFL draft happening next week. So a lot of teams get better during this time of the year. And we'll be following along with these storylines. Mike, I really appreciate the time and all the insight today. A lot of great conversations we had today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. Thanks, Felix. Appreciate it, man.